voice17104.com. This is Zanetta Wingfield, and you're listening to The Voice 17104.com. The Voice 17104.com.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice. Greetings and salutations, my friend. Welcome again to the Richard James Show. Yeah, I'm still here. We're still dealing with it. Today we have a pleasure of doing a show where we get involved in the problems of the elderly. And being an elder myself, some of these issues and these problems befall myself. Housing, affordable housing, is one problem. Health care, not being discriminated against. I had a colonoscopy myself last year and was told that I wouldn't get any more because I was too old. Does that mean I don't have any issues or problems anymore with age, that I'm problem free? That kind of thing. People who live in nursing homes sometimes get horrible care. Sometimes they get good care. But they have staff sometimes are undertrained. They don't have the resources. They don't have the appropriate diet for this particular person. Person might be diabetic and they're giving them lots of sugar. I had a cousin, Odessa Milton, that passed a couple of weeks ago. And it's my understanding that she fell and that no one was helping her or holding her. That's what I was told. And she was not given the appropriate medical treatment. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I know it happens, and it happens very, very often. I know through all this whole COVID virus epidemic that the largest percentage, and what I'm told, the largest percentage of people that was passing from this epidemic were the elderly. And I talked to a young lady by the name of Annette Brand, who told me that some folks who would rather stay in their home and their facility, there's money available on a state and county level to provide for that, and that the resources are being cut short. It's just impossible for people to make it without some kind of support. I had Bob Woodson, old friend, someone who I've known for many years, who started out in the civil rights movement. We had him on the show a couple of weeks ago, talking about how self-help and how things we can do for ourselves. There's some things that we can do for ourselves, but it's also there's some things that the collective must do. That's why you have income taxes. That's why you have Social Security. There are things that they must do to help the people who are in poverty. Well, one gentleman that seemed to be very, very, very sensitive to this issue is Senator Robert P. Casey, Jr. Very sensitive, and he is up for re-election. But he's held a hearing, and we're going to show that hearing, which projects the issues that elderly people have and the proposals that he has to bring about change. He had a report done on nursing home and the quality of nursing home and quality of the resources that are there. the things that are needed. And this report is being made public, and he's holding a hearing, and he has the experts in the field testifying in that hearing. So this is what we're going to deal with today. Before I get into directly this hearing, which deal with the problems of the elderly, I mentioned last week, and I'm just going to go through it again this week. There's an elderly gentleman by the name of Abdul Shabazz, aka Wilbur Johnson, who has been incarcerated in prison in the state of Delaware since 1975. Many years ago, in 75, he was involved in a criminal activity, which caused the incarceration. Since then, and this man's 80 years old, since then, with poor medical treatment, he's gone blind. But during that period, he's continued his education. He's got a bachelor's degree. He's a paralegal. And I know him as an individual that helped other people. And he helps other prisoners. Abdul Shabazz went before the parole board, and the parole board recommended that he be released. And he looked pretty good. The parole board, I mean, they had witnesses. I mean, everybody was talking about the rehabilitation and how well that he's done. But he was not released because the governor refused to let him go. And I'm just reaching out to Governor Delaware. Take another look at it, man. Look at the circumstance. Look at his situation. What good does it do to continue to punish this man who has served time, who will continue even with problems and issues to help others, who has gotten his degree, who has remorse, and who your parole board, who is supposed to be your experts, recommend that he be released? Take a look at it. And also, some of your attorneys out there, he needs legal help. So Abdul Shabazz, he needs legal help. So maybe there's some attorneys will take a look at it and maybe give him the kind of support that he needs. Okay, back to Senator Casey. You know, no, I'm not asking Senator Casey because he can't get involved. He represents the state of Pennsylvania, not the state of Delaware. So he can't really get involved in that at all. But others can. So, okay, we're gonna get started. Let's start the video, and then we'll come back in and take a look at it. All right? Okay, we'll start the video. Thank you.
By a large bipartisan vote in the House. I'd like to see that occur in the Senate too. Do look forward. Sometimes we're at odds in terms of what we should do, but there's always practical legislation in the middle. And I'd hope that we can have those conversations that get us there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Braun, thanks very much. Now I'll turn to the introduction of our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Jenny Schutz. Dr. Schutz is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro and works in urban economics and housing policy. Her research focuses on land use regulation, housing prices, urban amenities, and neighborhood change. Thank you for sharing your expertise and experience with us, Dr. Schutz. Our second witness is Ms. Allie Kennington. Ms. Kennington is the Senior Manager of Advocacy and Organizing at the Kelsey, where she leads policy and advocacy efforts to advance disability-forward housing solutions. She's dedicated to fueling justice movements for people with disabilities that are intersectional, sustainable, and intergenerational. Thank you for being here, Ms. Kennington, and sharing your expertise and your experience with the committee. I'll turn next to Ranking Member Braun for an introduction.
My pleasure to introduce Mr. Rick Wajda. He's the CEO of the Indiana Builders Association and one of the state's leading voices on residential construction in the housing industry. Rick has been with the Indiana Builder Association for over 20 years and will share his knowledge and experience with the committee today. He joins us from Fishers, Indiana, not too far from his alma mater, Butler University in Indianapolis. Thanks, Rick, for being here today.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. Our final witness is Dominique Howell, whom I mentioned earlier. Dominique is an advocate for the civil rights of people with disabilities, and she works to educate others about the discrimination parents with disabilities face. She has personally experienced the barriers that people with disabilities confront in finding accessible housing. Thank you, Dominique, for being here today and for sharing your story with the committee. And now we'll start with Dr. Schutz for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chair Casey, Ranking Member Braun, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the important issue of accessible and affordable housing for older adults and people with disabilities. It's an honor to be here. My name is Jenny Schutz. I'm a senior fellow at Brookings Metro. My comments today will provide some broader context on housing challenges facing older adults and people with disabilities. Restrictive zoning makes it hard to produce enough housing to meet demand, especially accessible and affordable housing. Since the Great Recession, the U.S. has not built enough housing to keep pace with the demand created by job and population growth. Local governments across the U.S. have adopted restrictive zoning rules and complex discretionary development processes that decrease the amount of new construction and increase housing costs. Rules such as single-family exclusive zoning create direct barriers to building accessible homes that meet the needs of people with disabilities and older adults. Accessory dwelling units, duplexes, and apartments in elevator buildings are all critical parts of the housing ecosystem that supports safe, independent living as well as informal caregiving within families. Rising housing costs create more financial stress for low-income households and people living on fixed incomes. The poorest 20% of households spend more than half of their income on housing costs, leaving too little money to cover other necessities. Rapidly rising housing costs are particularly challenging for older adults and people with disabilities who often live on fixed incomes. Among low-income people with disabilities, only 16% receive federal housing subsidies. Two recent trends foreshadow greater housing insecurity among older adults than in previous generations. A larger share of older adults today are renters, due partly to the lingering effects of the foreclosure crisis. Older homeowners also have higher debt levels because they are more likely to have a mortgage and larger mortgage balances. Retrofitting existing homes and communities is essential to improving safety and accessibility. The U.S. housing stock is aging along with the population. Older homes are generally more affordable, but they are also more likely to have maintenance problems that can create unsafe or unhealthy living conditions. Much of the unsubsidized affordable rental housing stock lacks accessibility features, such as elevators and doorways wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs. Retrofitting millions of older homes is an enormous task that will require both private and public capital. An important policy consideration is how to balance the benefits of building codes and related regulations that require accessible features with the costs to property owners of conducting retrofits. Homes are only one piece of the built environment that impacts accessibility. Many older adults and people with disabilities cannot drive, and therefore face challenges safely navigating their communities. Relatively inexpensive and fast infrastructure investments could improve neighborhood safety and accessibility. These include improving sidewalk quality, extending the time allotted for pedestrians crossing streets, and adding benches at bus stops. Removing regulatory barriers to neighborhood-serving retail would also make it easier for older adults and people with disabilities to reach shared community spaces, from shopping centers to libraries and parks. Congress can improve housing accessibility and affordability for older adults and people with disabilities through 4 channels. First, create financial incentives for local governments to revise their zoning to allow a wider range of accessible housing types. The bipartisan infrastructure law includes some models for how to do this. Second, HUD should provide technical assistance and clear guidance to local governments on the types of zoning and building code reforms that are most important to accessibility and affordability. Third, provide flexible financial support for low-income older adults and people with disabilities through increased funding for housing vouchers or targeted tax credits. Fourth, encourage accessibility retrofits for existing homes and neighborhood-serving pedestrian infrastructure through funding already allocated in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Expanding the supply of safe, accessible, affordable housing is a critical quality of life issue for millions of older adults and people with disabilities. Once-in-a-generation federal infrastructure investments offer a unique opportunity to upgrade the safety and accessibility of homes and neighborhoods. Accomplishing these goals will require sustained and coordinated efforts from federal, state, and local governments, as well as the private and nonprofit sectors. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Dr. Schutz, thanks very much for your testimony. Ms. Cannington.
Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the Special Committee of Aging, thank you so much for inviting me to testify today. I sit before you both as senior manager at the Kelsey and as a disabled person who's deeply felt the severe shortage of accessible, affordable, and inclusive housing in my own life and in the lives of people I know and love across the country. Co-led by people with and without disabilities, the Kelsey pioneers accessible, affordable, and inclusive housing through public, private, and philanthropic partnerships to develop mixed income, disability forward housing. We also advance market and policy conditions so that this type of housing can become the norm nationwide. Our country's housing crisis disproportionately impacts people with disabilities and older adults. This is why we are here today. And even more acutely, it impacts those who are Black, Brown, and Indigenous. 1 in 4 adults are disabled, and 2 in 5 seniors have a disability. Disabled people are twice as likely to live in poverty, and no one living on the supplemental security income can afford housing in any US market. People with disabilities experience the highest rates of housing discrimination, and less than 5% of our housing stock is accessible. At least half of those turning to shelters are disabled, and over 18 million people with disabilities are eligible for housing assistance, but not receiving it. Our country still upholds institutional bias, with at least 3.3 million disabled people and older adults stuck in institutional settings because there isn't the housing that they need in their own communities. We have failed millions, but there are tangible solutions that can be enacted now to create what we call a more disability-forward housing future. Disability-forward housing is housing that is affordable to people of all incomes, especially those who are extremely low income. It is accessible, located, designed, and built to meet a diverse range of accessibility needs, from cognitive to chronic illness to hearing and vision and more. It is inclusive, which means housing that does not segregate or isolate, but is mixed between people with and without disabilities and supports people to receive access to services in their own homes. Designing disability-forward housing means designing better housing for everyone, people across geographies, incomes, and housing needs. It can include mixed income communities with homes ranging from deeply affordable to essential workforce housing. It includes resident-centered programming that brings elements of interdependence, informal support networks, access to services, and connected community living that benefit all. Designing for all kinds of bodies up front can lower costs. Not planning ahead can lead to unscheduled maintenance and a hit to already limited operating budgets. Disability-forward housing does not have to make a project cost more. When comparing the costs of our projects at the Kelsey to others, ours are cost competitive, proving that this is possible. We have learned through our developments and technical assistance, as well as through the Kelsey's housing design standards for accessibility and inclusion, that with the right partners and investments, disability-forward housing can be scaled to transform the lives of people with and without disabilities from America's city centers to rural communities. We need, though, congressional and regulatory action to make this future possible. We have a legal framework to mandate fair and integrated housing, but we have never adequately invested in the housing infrastructure to make these rights a reality for the ever-growing disabled population. We can improve and invest in programs that we know work but have been woefully underfunded, like HUD Section 811, 202, the HUD Service Coordination Program, Housing Choice Vouchers, including as well as specifically the Mainstream Voucher Program, as well as innovative project-based subsidy programs, as well as transit-oriented development and the Housing Trust Fund, as well as public housing. We must invest in and strengthen Medicaid home and community-based services, including housing-related services. We also can embed a disability-forward solution across the entire housing infrastructure, like within the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC, which funds the vast majority of affordable housing and supports over 6 million jobs annually. Passing legislation like the VITAL Act, Senate Bill 1377, would finance up to 970,000 more affordable, accessible homes over 10 years. It would be a critical step forward. We can increase requirements and incentivize access and inclusion across all federal programs and better align HUD and Medicaid. We can build new programs that make the right to community living for disabled people a reality. This includes creating voucher programs that are more explicitly for disabled people of all ages who qualify for Medicaid home and community-based services. And we can create a national home modification program for people who every day are left to their own accord to make essential changes to their homes. As well as we can establish HUD senior leadership to oversee disability-forward solutions are embedded across the agency. Through all of these interventions and more, you can move us towards a more disability-forward housing future. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cannington. And we'll move now to our fourth witness, Mr. Wajda. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing that right. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. I am pleased to appear before you today on behalf of the Indiana Builders Association to share our views on the state of housing and the barriers our industry is currently facing to provide safe and affordable housing at all price points and for all sectors of the home buying public, including older Americans. My name is Rick Wajda, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the Indiana Builders Association. The Indiana Builders Association represents over 2,600 member companies engaged in the residential and light commercial construction industry across the state of Indiana, and we are also affiliated with the National Association of Home Builders. The primary challenge to the building industry is the lack of attainable, affordable housing in the single-family and multifamily markets. These challenges are consistent across the board for rental units as well as for-sale housing. Indiana has done an excellent job over the years of attracting employers to our communities and making our state a great place to live. But with low inventory and rising material and labor costs, our members are having a difficult time providing workforce housing to Hoosiers. Record low inventory in a building industry that has not met current demand for new housing at various price points has created a shortage of available workforce housing. Estimates indicate a shortage of new homes across the state of 30 to 50,000 units. Put into context, Indiana needs roughly 18 to 22,000 new houses a year to meet average demand, and only produced over 18,000 new homes in 2020 for the first time since 2007. Why were home builders underbuilding coming out of the recession? After the downturn, the number of home builders declined significantly, and the availability of financing for acquisition, development, and construction activities were severely constrained. These factors significantly limited the production of new housing when housing demand was increasing across the country. According to the National Association of Home Builders Priced Out report, the 2023 median new home price in Indiana is now $397,000. The income needed to qualify for the median new home price is roughly $120,000. Of the approximately 2.8 million households in Indiana, over 75% are unable to afford the median price of a new home. These numbers hold true across the country as well. In Pennsylvania, 86% of the households are unable to afford the median price of a new home. Ohio, 81%. Nebraska, 75%. Arizona, 81%. The U.S. average is 73% for households unable to afford the median price of a new home. On top of these already challenging dynamics, any increase in housing costs push potential buyers out of the market. In Indiana, for every $1,000 increase in the cost of a house, over 3,000 households are priced out of the market. That number is over 140,000 nationally. Take, for example, inflationary pressures and rising mortgage rates. In March of 2020, the new median house price in Indiana was $296,000, and the interest rate on a 30-year mortgage was roughly 3.5%. Assuming a 20% down payment, the monthly payment, excluding taxes and property insurance, was just over $1,000 a month. Today, that same house costs nearly $400,000, or 34% more, and the interest on that same 30-year mortgage is 7.25%, more than double the rate. As a result of these increases, the new monthly mortgage payment today is over $2,100, $1,100 more a month for roughly the same house. The fact is, homeownership is unattainable for many across Indiana and the country, including two-earner households due to tight supply, inflationary pressures, regulatory costs, and rising mortgage rates, which is why we must look at reducing the cost of housing at all levels. According to the National Association of Home Builders Economics Group, nearly 25% of the cost of a new home nationwide can be attributed to regulations. Regulations come in many forms and can be imposed by various levels of government. At the local level, jurisdictions may charge permit fees, hookup fees, and impact fees, and establish development construction standards that either directly increase cost to builders and developers or cause delays that translate to higher costs. State and federal governments may be involved in this process directly or indirectly. For example, restrictive building codes add thousands of dollars to the cost of a house, making it that much more difficult to qualify for a mortgage. In terms of identifying solutions to improve affordability, we must rebuild the industry's infrastructure, which includes our labor force and reliable sources of lending and building materials. All regulations should be examined for their impact on housing affordability. Communities can reduce the cost of producing new housing by eliminating fee increases, assist with infrastructure costs, and allowing for higher density housing where the market demands it. Our aging population may want to age in place or age in community. Creativity and options to allow this must be explored and implemented. In Indiana, the General Assembly recently concluded and passed legislation that creates a residential infrastructure fund to the tune of $75 million over the next 2 years to assist in communities building out infrastructure for residential housing. Think sewers, roads, sidewalks, etc. This transformative piece of legislation will open up areas for development and reduce the infrastructure costs currently paid for upfront by the builder developer, but ultimately passed on in the cost of the home to the home buyer. In conclusion, our citizens, and particularly older Americans, want to choose where they live and the type of home that best meets their needs. Our industry stands ready to assist in helping to expand the availability of safe and affordable housing. Thank you, Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the committee for your time today.
Thank you very much. And our final witness is Dominique Howell.
Chairman Casey, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. Thank you for inviting me here today to share my story. My name is Dominique Howell. I am a disability advocate from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I am an independent living specialist at Liberty Resources, Inc., a center for independent living in southeastern Pennsylvania. Today, I am here to speak about the importance of affordable, accessible housing in Philadelphia and nationwide. With a population of 12.90 million residents as of 2021 in Pennsylvania, disabled residents make up at least 25% of the population, which equates to 2,677,350 residents. I feel that it is imperative to focus on the needs of the disability community while also understanding that it is not just a regional issue, but a national one. Many of you may have realized that affordable, accessible housing in Pennsylvania does not meet the demands of disabled residents in need. For decades, there has been affordable housing shortage, which has continually led to chronic housing insecurities. This includes homelessness and evictions because many residents cannot afford the rising rent costs on fixed income. For example, last year, the Independent Living Services Department of Liberty Resources, Inc. received an average of 100 calls per month for disabled people needing housing. This is especially true in Philadelphia, including myself. 5 years ago, my family and I, which included my then 3-year-old daughter and my aging grandmother, were wrongfully evicted due to a decision made by the owners of the property. They no longer wanted to make repairs to my inaccessible apartment, which was required by the Philadelphia Housing Authority to continue to receive payments. The owners made the decision that they would no longer accept the subsidy, which led to our eviction because we could no longer afford market rent rate rent on our own. With the help of some advocacy, my grandmother was able to be housed once we were evicted. Unfortunately, my daughter and I weren't as lucky and were denied entry into the Office of Homeless Services twice because I am a recipient of home and community-based services and receive attended care hours. I receive home and community-based services so that I can remain living independently in the community. The Office of Homeless Services intake staff stated that my attendant could not enter the shelter because of the services I received. After getting legal representation and constant advocating, I was able to enter the shelter, but not without lack of accessibility. For a year, I slept in my power wheelchair, even while in the shelter. After fighting, advocating, and sharing my personal story, my daughter and I now have a place to call home. Even though my daughter and I now have a place to call home, it does not come without accessibility challenges. Unfortunately, even though the building we live in has other tenants with disabilities, the elevator is constantly broken, which leaves many residents, including myself, trapped in our homes, sometimes for weeks on end. My entire life, I had to make the decision between accessibility and affordability, as so many other Americans with disabilities do. As an example, for the first time in my life, I now have a bathroom that is accessible enough for my wheelchair to enter and be able to close the door. As an advocate and activist, personally and professionally, one of my primary focuses is to continue housing justice because housing is a human right, and unfortunately, far too many Americans, especially people with disabilities, are not being equally granted the right of housing they can afford that is accessible. It is my opinion that Pennsylvania and other states across the country should decrease their focus on market value development and increase their efforts to developing affordable, accessible housing to match the needs of its residents. It is my hope that as members of Senate, you decide to take a stance and work diligently to help grant people with disabilities across the United States with their right of affordable, accessible housing. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thanks.
Ms. Howell, thanks very much for your testimony. I wanted to start a round of questions. My first question is for Ms. Cannington. We know that people with disabilities face hardships. I think that's a real understatement. They face those hardships at a rate that is higher than people without disabilities. For example, they're twice as likely to live in poverty, to face a persistent wage gap, and to struggle to afford housing costs. We've got to do more to ensure that federal housing assistance programs are both, as we've said a number of times today, accessible and affordable for people with disabilities. I mentioned LIHTC, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's the nation's primary driver of new stock affordable housing. This is a good program. It's had bipartisan support for many, many years. LIHTC provides tax credits to developers who build new housing for low-income renters, but currently there's no requirement under the program as it exists today to build disability-friendly housing. It's just a gap in the program. The VITAL Act that I've introduced would add an accessibility standard for that tax credit program, ensuring that investment in building of new, affordable, and accessible housing is possible. So here's my question, Ms. Cannington. Are states meeting the needs of people with disabilities through the LIHTC program?
Thank you, Senator Casey, for your question. So as you spoke to, LIHTC is the primary driver of affordable housing. And through LIHTC, all states are allocated tax credits. And each state, through their qualified allocation plan, can decide where those tax credits can be prioritized. There are 28 states that completely, at the state level, also lack accessibility requirements. But then there are some states that are leading the way, that are adding both accessibility requirements and incentives. But the bottom line is that disabled people and older adults, no matter where they live in the country, should expect a standard of accessibility in the housing stock. And so by reforming the low-income housing tax credit to both increase the requirement as well as incentivize developers to build more accessible and adaptive housing, the disabled people and older adults will increase our confidence level and the standard, as well as create more uniformity across the development field about what is accessible housing and how can LIHTC ensure that it drives not just affordable housing, but more accessible and adaptable to all.
So you said 28 states,
Completely lack tax credit accessibility requirements. And then there's 22 states that vary in their accessibility requirements. And so we look to the federal government for leadership in that regard.
well, that's an interesting breakdown of all the states. I guess one question I have is, what are the characteristics of housing that's designed for the needs of people with disabilities? Kind of describe what would be, for lack of a better word, the ideal circumstance.
Thank you, Chairman. So at the Kelsey, and when we talk about disability forward housing design, we look at cross disability access. So that means not just meeting the minimum code requirements when they do exist, which is mobility and sensory, so important, but the 61 million disabled people we are an incredibly diverse group. And so we break down those characteristics of access in 6 main impact areas. So hearing and acoustics, vision, health and wellness, cognitive access, and support needs. Some of the features and characteristics that I want to lift up that go beyond code requirements, but by embedding them from the start doesn't have an additional cost, are things like plain language leases, are things like wayfinding in a building that when you implement these accessibility, these cross-disability access characteristics, it doesn't just benefit those groups, but benefits all.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. I'll turn to Ranking Member Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wajda, you talked about in Indiana, the median home price, $397,000. I mean, that just seems outrageously high as a median. And that's actually higher than what the median is across the country. Interest rates, we talked about where they are. But regulation, as it comes from here especially, can you cite a couple of the key regulations that drive costs up? And generally, they're always well-intended, but then can work at cross purposes for the affordability factor. If you would highlight a couple of the most challenging ones from here, and then likewise coming from our own state.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Ron. The regulations are a huge factor, right? If you take you roughly 25% of the cost of a home is due to regulations. I like to say that's no sticks and that's no bricks going into the house. That's simply government regulations that further reduce housing affordability all across this great country. And so if you look at the federal level, it could be regulations dealing with stormwater. A recently Supreme Court decided case, the Sackett case dealing with wetlands on private property, are all regulations that are ultimately added to the cost when a home builder and a developer is looking to develop a piece of ground. They have to take into account those regulations and pass those costs on to the home buyer. That continues to raise the cost of housing. At the local level, a lot of times we see architectural standards baked into local ordinances. So certain communities want housing in their community to look a certain way. They may want all brick houses. They may want certain roof pitches, 3-car side load garages, larger lot densities. Those are all things that we can provide as home buyers to the consumer and to the public, but those come at a cost. And so if we can get creative at the local level and communities can start to look at reducing lot sizes and allowing smaller houses to be built in their communities, we think we can attempt to drive down the cost of housing.
I want to give a shout out to a company in Indiana, the Cook Medical Group, who does medical device manufacturing as its business, but has taken on trying to make affordable housing something that they're going to try to make weigh in on. And in talking to Steve Ferguson, the CEO of the group, he said they found a formula to get housing in a slab home, 3 bedrooms, and I've seen them, and they are nice starter homes for between $185,000, $215,000, which all of a sudden, if you're there, even with today's interest rates, look what you're doing in terms of affordability. I don't know how far that goes into the income quartiles, but if you could do that, and he said the single biggest factor was getting the local jurisdiction to stub in utilities, which most local jurisdictions can, and then it enabled him to be able to experiment to get homes built in that range. Does that happen much across Indiana, or would that be the exception rather than the rule?
I would say, Senator Braun, that's the exception rather than the rule, but it's certainly a creative approach that I think many large employers may want to look. If they need workforce, they're going to need to have some sort of cooperative agreement for housing for their workers. And Senator Braun and Chairman Casey have a lot in common in terms of a long, rich history in your states of the steel mills. And a lot of those communities were built with the assistance of those steel mills back in there to make sure that they had affordable housing for their workers close to the factories. And maybe we've got to take a look at some of those cooperative partnerships moving forward with our employment community.
Well, I think that's one example to where you don't have to look here. You can take that issue into your own hands, and we've had measurable results. I want to get final question on inflation. That robs across the board purchasing power. It's largely offset any of the wage gains that we've made. COVID exposed a lot of places where employers need to acknowledge that if you don't pay a living wage, you're not only going to be losing the ability to have an affordable home, many other issues as well. I challenge employers throughout the country to make sure to take that into consideration. But what is the current status of inflation impacting building materials? Are we coming back down? Is something within sight of where we'll get back to where we were pre-COVID?
I think, Senator Braun, lumber prices certainly have came back down, but we've seen increases in other building materials that have continued to drive the cost of housing up. We have not seen that stabilize yet. And so as you see, maybe the price of wood and lumber dropping back to some pre-COVID levels, but we've also seen those increases in other products that continue to challenge the market. And certainly you mentioned with mortgage rates going up, right? The challenge to get somebody qualified for an entry-level home in the United States of America is very difficult right now. And so we need to do everything we can to try to drive those rates down and get the cost of materials down so we can build more houses.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ranking Member Braun. I'll start another round of questions. Now, we'll be waiting for, and are waiting for other senators to appear at the hearing so they can do their questions. So we'll have some who will appear in this segment of the hearing. And as some of you might know, we'll have to take, Ranking Member Braun and I will have to take a break to go down to a Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee, so-called HELP Committee markup, where we're considering legislation, pandemic all hazards legislation that we've got to get done today. So we'll take a break and come back, and I think at that point we'll have other senators. But for the time being, I just have a few more for this round. Ms. Howell, I'll start with you. As you know, many people with disabilities and older adults prefer to remain in their homes. As we heard from Ms. Cannington, the current housing stock is largely inaccessible, forcing many to leave their communities for congregate settings, which in many instances would be a nursing home if you're an older adult. We must ensure that older adults and people with disabilities can safely age in place and aren't forced to live in an institutional setting because their home can't support their needs. So Dominique, I would ask you, how does the opportunity to have an accessible home impact your ability to remain in your own home and community?
Well, the opportunity that I've been afforded to have an accessible home has allowed me to be a productive member of society, a great advocate, and an even better mother. Without the opportunity to have an accessible home, I would not be able to do any of those things. I would not be able to be an independent living specialist. I would not be able to fight for housing justice, and I would not be able to be a loving, supportive parent.
That's pretty fundamental, just getting through your day and being a parent. So difficult. I was noting in your testimony that you said at the end of the third paragraph, quote, "I was able to enter the shelter, but not without lack of accessibility. For a year, I slept on my power wheelchair, even while in the shelter," unquote. I can't imagine a year like that, but I hope, and it seems like things are a little better for you today.
Things are wonderful.
That's great.
Full job and a full life, and so I'm blessed. But there are many Americans that are not afforded that opportunity, and so that is why I'm here today.
Yep.
Thank you for your question.
And I'll next turn to Dr. Schutz. I wanted to ask you about home modifications, which is part of the discussion here. People with disabilities of all ages need safe housing that supports their ability to live in their communities, but many live in homes not designed for their needs, and often they struggle to afford necessary home modifications like installing a wheelchair ramp or a zero-step shower. These modifications help these Americans prevent accidents and maintain their independence. To help constituents, primarily older adults and people with disabilities, as well as veterans, connect to resources so they can live in age and place, our committee offers a home modification resource guide. I'm just holding it up. It's entitled Modifying Your Home for Accessibility and Safety. And then this particular version says resources for Pennsylvanians. The table of contents kind of says it all. There's a section or a chapter on resources for veterans, resources for rural homeowners, resources for SSI beneficiaries, for older adults, for people with disabilities. Just by way of example, I was looking at the section on resources for rural homeowners. This is how it starts. It says, the Section 504 Home Repair Program provides loans and grants to low-income homeowners to repair, improve, and modernize their homes. It also provides grants to older and very low-income homeowners to improve health and safety standards. So this is particularly focused on Americans who are in rural communities. One of my constituents, Suzanne Ott from Venango County, that's just north of Pittsburgh, told me how her husband uses a wheelchair, but because the doors are not wide enough in their home, he can't use it in the house. She said he has to, quote, crawl on his hands and knees to get inside the house and move around, unquote. Suzanne and her family used the home modifications brochure to find resources to widen their doorways and install stair lifts. She remarked how these changes will allow her husband to, quote, truly be independent, unquote, and to get around and do as he pleases. So Dr. Schutz, how can we better strengthen and streamline national resources for home modifications?
Thanks for that question. The home modifications are a really important part of making our existing stock more accessible. It's often complicated. As Ms. Cannington said, there are a lot of different kinds of modifications that would be necessary, and it's a question of matching the home characteristics to the resident and to their needs. So it's often hard to come up with a fairly direct sort of cookie cutter version of this that can be implemented everywhere. We do know that some general rules of thumb for making programs more accessible is, one, to make sure that there's targeted marketing and outreach to eligible households so that they know that these products are available Second, to make sure that the application process is as easy and straightforward as possible, reduce the administrative burden so it's easy for people to access the resources that they're eligible for. And then third, to make sure that there are trusted intermediaries who can help doing the contracting work to provide good quality work at fair prices and make sure that people aren't overpaying for the services. So those are good general rules of thumb for making the program more accessible and making sure that the funding is spent well.
Thank you, Doctor. Ranking Member Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I do visit all 92 counties in our state, by far the issue I hear, even above and beyond rural broadband, affordable housing, would be workforce. That was pre-COVID. It's probably mentioned twice as often now. In our state, we had 65,000 jobs that needed a better high school education, basic life skills. When I went to high school, you could take engine mechanics, you could take wood or metal shop, you could learn to weld. You had those kinds of parts of your curriculum that I think prepared you, whether you're going to enlist, go into employment right out of high school, or get further education. Where are we at in our own state? I know when I was in the state legislature, it was always talked about. Seemed like we never kind of aggregated our efforts towards it. And how big a deal is it? Do we have enough electricians and plumbers, and let alone all the other kind of skills you need to build a home? How are we doing in Indiana?
Great question, Senator Braun, and the challenges are certainly there in all sectors of the construction industry, whether it's residential construction, commercial construction, road building. You know, for example, our membership in our association was over 7,000 member companies across the state of Indiana before the Great Recession. Now we have shy of 3,000 members. A lot of those companies closed their doors. A lot of those folks went to a different occupation and didn't come back into the construction industry. And we have an aging workforce that is aging out of the construction industry, and we haven't backfilled enough positions with our younger generations that to let them know there are great careers in the construction industry and can make a very good living for themselves and their families if that's the pathway that they desire. So we're making a very strong concerted effort with all of our partners in the construction industry, commercial, union, non-union, and residential as well, to let them know there are great careers out there. You can make a very good living. If you choose to go to a four-year institution, that's great, but you don't have to. You can go and become an electrician, a plumber. We need more of those than you can imagine right now. They're in high demand, and if you're willing to get a little dirty and work hard, you can have a great living for yourself and your family.
Well, it's good to let that out there so people know that's a place to go. And where the cost of post-secondary education has gone, it's pricing itself out of the market. We're going to have to, STEM degrees are underproduced in Indiana, for instance, and we need more of them to fill that high demand, very high pay niche. But then you've got high demand, high wage jobs that even through COVID have become more so. And if we, through the guidance that you get in high school, companies need to reach out to their middle schools and high schools to get involved. Garrett High School, for instance, near Fort Wayne, they bought acreage next to their high school and they build a home each year. And the kids love it. They're going to make more money in many cases than most four-year degrees would produce. And they're going to have a job the day they get their diploma, and a job that can pay for the things you need in this life. So I think education has got to come along to be part of the solution, because if you're not getting enough, you're going to have to pay even more to get people into the field. And I remember too, Indiana Manufacturers Association, they wanted just the school system to produce that perfect employee mix that they needed. Well, that wasn't happening. That was as recently as 8 years ago. I see that occurring too. And some of the companies that are having the least amount of trouble hiring people are communicating with their local school systems. And then kids, they get those general life schools, and the parents get the information of high demand, high wage, cost of education, career wages, we can do a better job of getting people in places where we need it. And housing would be one of those places. It seems like we got a lot of room to improve as well, but it does look like we're making steps in the right direction.
Senator, I would agree. And right, as I mentioned earlier, with the loss of so many subcontractors and building industry professionals coming out of the last recession, if you're a residential home builder and you call 5 plumbers and get quotes for a project, you're going to get a competitive bid. Today, there might only be 1 plumber in town to give you that bid. And so all those factors go into the affordability challenges that we're seeing today. Is we need more workers, we need more competition to try to continue to drive that cost of providing that service.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Braun. As I said, now we'll take a break. The committee will recess until 11 a.m.
Okay. Okay, Chris. Let's move along. Thank you for, so much for giving us the opportunity to air this hearing. There's some very important issues that will raise affordable housing. Affordable housing is one thing, and those prices are just off the charts. I've been looking at some videos about the exploding problem of homelessness in this country. Nathaniel Gaskin did an article on the homelessness in Harrisburg. Did a wonderful job in exposing it. Here, I don't understand something. Maybe people could explain to me. Why are we talking about spending $7 million destroying the old William Penn High School? Why couldn't you take that building, that structure that's there, that's been used for some community activity, and put apartments and rooms in there where people can stay? Why spend $7 million to destroy it? You got a building that's not being used. In a small town like Harrisburg, that can go a mighty, mighty long way and doing some good for our people. Telling people that you got to move. If you don't move by a certain date, then you're going to be evicted. We have a rodent problem and a disease problem because they're staying there. Well, why are they there? You think people want to live under a bridge? They need a place to stay. And we're talking about, and it's even compounded when you're talking about people who are elderly or people who are disabled. Because a disabled person can do so much. Also, take a look at mental health. What are we doing to correct the problem? Now, you probably know more than I do. And then we have a state hospital. Do you remember that? The Harrisburg State Hospital, that whole campus, how is that being used? Or we're just letting it rot out and tore down? There are facilities that we already have in the community. We're not taking a careful look at what we have and how we can convert that and where people who have needs can use them. Mental health is equally as important as physical health. Because if you don't have the mental health to guide you, then you're going to wind up homeless or under a bridge or even deceased. So what I'm saying, and I'm ignorant. I mean, I don't know. When I see these empty buildings, large structures, when I see campuses, why can't the utility companies, the city government, private industry come together and some kind of network or some kind of commission and take a look at what we have and what we could do with what we have, rather than neglect it and let it go to waste? And when you talk about things such as crime, and in most urban areas, and we have a real problem with crime in the Harrisburg area. Drive-by shootings and child abuse. A lot of these things, when people are under pressure, when people have nowhere to turn, nowhere to live, quality food not there, poor medical health, what do you expect but crime? And people react to their condition. Either they're angry at life and angry at themselves, or they just are just in a state of total despair. And what I'm saying to you is that use what we have. Take it and turn it around. And elect those conscientious individuals who know how to do that. And do I lift up Bob Casey? Yes, I do. And am I partial toward Bob Casey? Yes, I am. Because I know the man. I know his family. I know the kind of principles that Robert B. Casey has. And when I listen to this hearing, the man is on the job. Pennsylvania cannot afford to lose a senator like Robert B. Casey. Casey and even his father come along once in a lifetime. So let's keep Casey in office so that we can begin to correct some of these issues or work more diligently on a federal level. And then now we got a progressive governor in the state of Pennsylvania that has to ward off some of these totally right-wing individuals who don't believe in helping folks, who don't believe in Social Security. They're going to change it and privatize Social Security. They got all kinds of nonsense going on. The people who want to do something, let's keep them in office. And so I just want to say to you that we're going to continue to lift up positive things and share information with you. We want to thank the Thomases, keep on keeping on improving and adding good shows and allowing individuals like myself to broadcast and to be able to raise up issues. And again, I want to repeat the problem with Mr. Shabazz. I'm going to keep on talking until somebody contact us and let us know that they can help. Somehow he needs legal representation, and we also need a governor that cares. Thanks again. Much love to all of you, and I'll see you next week. This is Richard James signing off. Take care, my friends. Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. We thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let us hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.